Okay, this is Tuesday, November 14th, an oral history interview with Barry Boehm at the Computer History Museum. I'm David Brock, and I'm joined by Hansen Hsu here with me at the museum, and Lee Osterweil is joining by a video link. So Barry, in doing a little bit of background research, I saw that you were born in 1935, but I didn't see where. Could you tell us a little bit about where you were born and where you grew up?
I was born in Santa Monica, California, at a hospital called Mary Martin's, which is now a Toyota dealership.
And can you tell us a little bit about your family of origin, your mother, father, the family you grew up in?
Okay, so my parents grew up and met in Cleveland, Ohio, and in the early 30s, Cleveland, Ohio was not a great place for jobs and things like that, and so they decided that they would trundle out in a car and drive out to California, where it seemed like there were better job opportunities, and Santa Monica was sort of the corporate city for Douglas Aircraft, and my dad got a job basically assembling airplanes for a while, and eventually he got into middle management and purchasing and things like that. So, but yeah, it was pretty much of a company town. That all the bus routes could get you workers from wherever they were living in Santa Monica to the plant, and there's a theater in Santa Monica called the Aero Theater, and it's basically was put there by Douglas as a sort of an entertainment for the workers.
And had your father had a technical background before that, or what had been his
Not
interest?
really, no.
Okay.
He was good at baseball, bowling, and a whole bunch of things like that. Very, very friendly, easy to get along with person, and did well, as far as I could tell, with his career at Douglas Aircraft. So, yeah.
Was the company, it sounds like the company was both a big part of the community there in Santa Monica and also your family. Was that a big part of your youth growing up?
Yeah, quite a few of the classmates had their parents working for Douglas and the like. Yeah, when I got to high school, one summer I got an intern job at Douglas bucking rivets, which basically is you sit inside the wing of an airplane, and somebody pushes a rivet at you through a hole, and you put a piece of metal up against it, and they go rat-tat-tat-tat-tat. And it was a pretty noisy thing to do. So
you were the bracing for what they were riveting against.
Yeah, right. Yeah. And so basically, if you hit one tap, then it was a good solid rivet. If it was two, you had to drill it out and try again, and that sort of thing. So the next summer, I was a page at the Santa Monica Public Library, which was a much more quiet kind of thing to spend your summer doing.
And did you attend the public schools in Santa Monica?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. What was your experience of school like?
It was basically a good time. My main sport was tennis, and we had a good tennis team that won championships and things like that. So yeah, the tennis team was sort of a main friends kind of thing. And school was, there was one math teacher who was particularly stimulating. And his name was Bob Crawford, and he was a very non-traditional teacher. He would illustrate things with gambling kind of stories and problems and things like that. But yeah, he went well beyond just doing algebra and geometry and trig, and getting you into pre-calculus and that kind of thing.
Were there opportunities with Bob Crawford to kind of do more math outside the classroom? Was there a math club or anything like that you took advantage of?
Not really, but he would give me problems to try to solve, and so that was pretty good. Yeah.
Was there? Did you have an interest in some of the other activities or pursuits that many times are associated with interest in mathematics, like puzzle solving or music? Were either of those part of your interests?
Yeah. I went through the traditional, your mother wanted you to practice the piano, and I made a deal that I'll do it for 2 more years if I can then go off and play baseball. But yeah, I still play the guitar and that sort of thing, so it's fun to have that as sort of a way to relax.
And we mentioned your summer work. I guess that was during high school. How was, I guess, as you were growing up, and I suppose into the earliest part of high school, perhaps, the Second World War must have been just well, no, I guess it's before high school. Just an experience for you growing up, especially in Santa Monica. What impressions did the war have on you?
Well, it made us concerned that a bit up the coast in Santa Barbara, there were actually some Japanese that shot at various buildings and the like. The Douglas factory was turned into something that looked like a residential area from above.
Oh, I didn't realize that.
And they had some things called barrage balloons that if the airplanes came, they would get caught in the cables of the barrage balloons and stuff like that. So yeah, you knew there was a war going on.
And in addition to your involvement with the tennis team and with your summer work, did you have any other primary hobbies or activities? Were you a big reader? Was there anything else that stands out?
Yeah, I was. I read a lot of things, and particularly I read a lot of science fiction.
I was just going to ask that.
Yeah.
Can you tell us about your interest there? What sorts of things you were reading? What?
Yeah, well, my gods were people like Isaac Asimov and Robert Heinlein and a whole bunch of other authors, and Ray Bradbury particularly lived in the Santa Monica area, and one of the neat things about being a library page is that people like Ray Bradbury would come in and say, "Could you go down and get me this copy of the 1948 Santa Monica Evening Outlook?" Or Christopher Isherwood would come in. So there were a bunch of interesting people in the community that you bumped into.
Was there any were science fiction authors that you followed doing doing local readings or anything like that you participated in, or was it mainly through the library work?
It was mainly through the library work, yeah. But I really believed that, yeah, we were going to go to Mars and colonize it and all that sort of thing. So.
Is that a reading interest that has stayed with you?
It did for a while, and then the more I got into things like the space world and the like, and people started reporting things from Mars and Venus that said they're hard to get to and they don't look very friendly. And so I really still read those things occasionally, but it's more of a minor thing now. Yeah.
Well, could you, and were computers at all in your consciousness through either direct experience or science fiction by the time you were ending high school?
The one stimulating thing that did orient me in that direction was that the Rand Corporation is also in Santa Monica, and they had a couple of high school days where you could go and talk to Rand mathematicians or see some of the Rand computing equipment that was, so they built their own computer called the Johnniac, which is sitting up here in the Computer History Museum right now. So.
And you took advantage of that and saw the Johnniac?
Yeah.
Did it, would you say that it made a big impression on you? I mean, it certainly, you remember it, but was it
no, it was just sort of a memory, and but yeah, we'll get to things a few years later. Basically, my parents divorced, and my mother and brothers and sisters all went down to San Diego, and so I lived there for a while and worked for what was called Convair, and then became General Dynamics. And at that time, there was no University of California at San Diego, and after graduating from Harvard, well, I interned as a programmer at Convair for after my sophomore and junior years, and so it was sort of the logical place to go to work afterwards. But it was stimulating, but basically I wanted to go somewhere where I could do research and get a PhD, and UCLA was sort of the logical place to go. And so I went up to Los Angeles and interviewed at Rand System Development Corporation and Raymond Wooldridge, and basically, since I had that impression of Rand before, I said, this is really a neat place, and it's in Santa Monica, and they are willing to let me have flexible hours so I could commute up to UCLA and take courses and that sort of thing.
Just to step back just a little bit, I was curious just about the story of how you came to go to Harvard. You know, was that one amongst a number of places that you were looking at? How did that come about?
It was really more diversity than specialization in technical things. So I got accepted at MIT and Caltech and Stanford and Harvard, and so at one point I was very interested in going to Caltech because again they had these high school summer things, and there were a couple of lectures by Richard Feynman that were just super stimulating, and this would be a great place to go. But I was really curious about what life was like at the other end of the country, and Harvard had sort of the #1 person in anthropology and history of religions and a whole bunch of things besides math, and plus having some really super mathematicians. And they had one of the best astronomy departments. So one of the nice things was the first year and a half I was there, I had to get a student job to make ends meet, so I was basically part of the kitchen crew, but at one point I took an astronomy course in my sophomore year, and followed up with some of the professors and said, is there any possibility that you would have any jobs for that I could do rather than wash dishes and that kind of thing? So,
Yeah.
and so they did need some people that could help out in some of the technical support things that they needed.
And so do you think it was your interest in and aptitude for mathematics in particular that explained, getting into that roster of schools? It's quite a good list.
And again, with the science fiction, the astronomical observatory was the place that you could get familiar with the planets and all that kind of stuff.
And so then it was returning, sort of, you combined returning to your mother's household in San Diego in the summers with this position at Convair, General Dynamics. And that was, I think, if my memory is serving correctly, it was 1955. That was your first kind of programming job. Could you paint that picture for us, what that was like? And
sure.
How did you get the job, by the way, the summer job?
Fortunately, Harvard has a alumni organization, and so if people wanted a job in a particular area, there were alumni who could help you get in. So the first, after my freshman year, I was a draftman at the Naval Electronics Lab, and basically drafting pieces of ships and things like that. And that was interesting, but not a career. And the next year they said, we can get you a job at Convair, and they do airplanes and rockets and things like that. And so I went into the personnel office and said, let's see what kind of jobs we have. What is your major? And my major is mathematics. And so he said, I'm looking at my blackboard over there, and it has propulsion and thermodynamics and digital computer lab. Well, digits are numbers, aren't they? So why don't you try that out? And so up to then, I was wondering what a math major did as a career, and being an actuary or a statistician or things like that didn't seem like really interesting stuff, and it wouldn't get you to Mars or anything like that.
So what was that laboratory like at Convair?
It was, again, they had one of the most powerful computers that was available at the time. It was a UNIVAC ERA 1103, and it was about the size of this room. And so I went over and got introduced to the supervisor, who walked me into this computer and said, "Yeah, this is what we do here. We write computer programs that help us analyze rocket trajectories and rocket stability analyses and structural analyses and things like that. And if you're going to be here, there's one thing I want you to keep in the front of your mind, which is that we're paying this computer $600 an hour, and we're going to pay you $2 an hour, and we'd like you to act accordingly." So basically, yeah, hardware was king, and so this introduced you to some really good habits that you want to manually execute your program before you put it on the $600 an hour computer, and you'd like to make sure that you had very thorough test cases and the like, and you tried to build programs that were extremely efficient and didn't chew up too many of these $600 hours in computing things.
What was the you mentioned to kind of manually execute the program before running it on the computer? Was that sounds like a very painstaking pencil and paper exercise. Is that correct, or what was that like?
Well, basically, you would put in some inputs, and you would manually execute the program, and in some cases it was a pretty messy thing. That my first program was to provide them a subroutine that could compute arctangents, and about the only way you could do this was using a series that says the arctangent is a times x plus b times x squared and the like, and manually executing those until it converged was not a lot of fun.
Barry, what language did you write that program? Was that Fortran, or was that assembly language?
That was really assembly language, yeah, and the input media was paper tape at the time, and the other thing that you could do in terms of debugging your program was that the memory was an electronic tube, and fundamentally it had 4K of memory, and when your program was executing, you could watch the places where it was executing, and if it started burning up a hole in the display, you knew it was in a tight loop, and you better turn it off and try again.
In talking to some other people working in software in this era, programming in this time, and after, several people have referred to kind of debugging also, not just by visual inspection of the memory tube, but by sound, that just the sound of the machine running, you could distinguish between the typical operation of the program or if it was getting into trouble of some kind. Was that part of your experience at all?
Not for the ERA 1103. When after this,
we used to put a little transistor radio on the console, and somehow the transistor radio picked up static or something like that. You could hear it, but you had to put a little transistor radio there. Things.
But there were clues like that. Yeah, when I went back to Harvard, I started taking they were really called numerical analysis courses, but you had to program things to do them and execute them on. They had a UNIVAC 1, and then they had the Harvard Mark IV, and the Mark IV was something that Howard Aiken had done the Mark 1 and 2 and 3, and it was better than those, but fundamentally programming was saying take this particular storage area and open up this wire and then push those bits down this wire until it gets to this other location here. And so in those cases, you couldn't see what was going on, but you could tell a little bit in terms of hearing what was going on. In terms of
you could hear the relays in one part of the
clickety,
machine going, and then in another part.
That kind of thing. Yeah.
Was the activity with? So we're talking now around 1956. Was the activity over on the MIT campus with Project Whirlwind or any of that? Did you have any exposure to that or know about that?
Not really, no. I knew my MIT was over there, but there wasn't really that much. There wasn't a Cambridge Computer Club or something like that.
Right. And the work on numerical analysis with the Mark IV, that didn't put you off of your interest in programming in computers? That was, it seems like you had turned to kind of focus in this direction.
Yeah, and it was something that you could see that you were doing useful things with it, and actually I almost put myself out of a job in that I was doing this work at the Harvard Observatory, and Harvard had 2 telescopes on 2 mountains in New Mexico, and they had a camera with some rotating shutters.
Mm-hmm.
So if a meteor came down, it would have a particular dotted line from here and a particular dotted line from there, and what you could do is take the photos and reduce the traces to numbers and go through a bunch of calculations on a Frieden calculator. Mm-hmm. that could tell you how high was it when it entered the atmosphere, and how fast was it going, and how long did it last, and mm-hmm. the like. And so so I did this really for the professors and the like, but they let me co-author a paper, and so my first technical paper was called "Photographic Lyrid Meteors."
And how, I'm not sure I followed how you almost put yourself out of a job. Did you program that?
Yeah, I decided, this pushing the Frieden was, if the computers could be available, and the observatory did have access to the UNIVAC 1, and so basically I created a program that would do all of the calculations that I still had to measure the things on the photographs and put those data into the computer program, but I didn't have to punch the computer all that time. And they found other useful things for me to do, which was good.
When you returned to General Dynamics in 1956, was this also working essentially to program mathematical routines for the kind of engineering simulations that were going on?
It was more and more. It was this was in the era of are we ahead or behind the Russians in intercontinental ballistic missiles and satellites and the like, and so the U.S. government basically had three money is no object intercontinental ballistic missile projects, and so Convair General Dynamics had the Atlas, Martin had the Titan, and Boeing had the Minuteman, and
Right.
so the first two were liquid rockets, and then the Minuteman was a solid rocket, and so basically, there was lots of money to do things, lots of computing equipment to invest in, lots of computer programs that people wanted to do a better and better job of getting more and more accurate engineering analysis of rocket vibrations, or there were certain situations that if the rocket didn't go fast enough, the pumps would cavitate, and so you had to simulate what was going on with the pumps and the liquid and that kind of thing as well. So.
And were there also, in the Convair computing laboratory you worked in, were there also electronic analog computers? Were you using, or were you only using digital computers?
No, I got to wire a bunch of plug boards. It was hybrid computing at the time.
Ah.
But there was a rivalry between the analog people and the digital people, saying, "You guys can't integrate digitally. We can do that automatically," and that sort of thing.
Was that really kind of two camps in computing? Was there a real analog-digital divide, would you say?
Well, because some of the problems required you to use both, there was really more of a friendly kind of thing, but there were all these push your button kind of things that would say you can't do what we can do, and that sort of thing.
Right.
Yeah.
Somehow I recall that the analog people thought that they could handle larger variations in quantities of numbers, and I never understood that. So they conceded that digital computing was more accurate, it was precise, but that it couldn't handle variations and the sizes of numbers, and I just never quite got that. Do you recall that?
Yeah, I don't recall them saying that, because it didn't. Yeah, the digital was certainly more accurate than the analog was, and but yeah, for certain kinds of situations where there were complex interactions among the various things that were being simulated, that the analog could do a better job than the digital, because the digital would have to make assumptions about, is this a steady state or an anomaly or things like that. So.
When you were finishing up your undergraduate studies, had you been talking with Convair about a permanent position with them after you graduated, or how was that unfolding?
That was unfolding. Well, yeah, basically. We had one problem with my family. A couple of people got sick, and that winter I went home to try to help out, and did a little bit of programming at General Dynamics, and at one point I was about to say I'm not going to be able to finish my senior year, and the people in the computer lab said, hey, don't do that. We'll pay your salary or your tuition or whatever. So I said, you don't have to do that, but I agree. I should really go and finish this. And so, but fundamentally, yeah, they basically said, yeah, we want to have you here permanently. So
wow.
So that was good.
Very generous offer.
It was a really nice thing for them to do.
And
it was a very interesting bunch of people. I had a carpool, and one of the people that was a programmer was Bob Price, who became the CEO of Control Data. Another one was Don Parker, who lives up here and was one of the early people in computer security and computer crime and that sort of thing. So it was right at the beginning with all these people growing up and filling interesting positions. Yeah.
Were people coming from? Was it the case like with other members of your carpool? Were these people who happened to be from Southern California, or had they come to Southern California to work with computers?
I'd say most of them were Southern Californians. Eventually, the demand for programmers got so high that this was more later when I left RAND and went to TRW. RAND was sort of a steady state, 1,000 people on the staff, and TRW was getting bigger and bigger. And so they would go back to Wisconsin and Minnesota and show them all of these pictures of what life was like on the beach. and so we did get a lot of people from the Midwest and that sort of thing.
Well, let's see. So when you took the job with Convair, General Dynamics, what was your initial role? Was that more of the same sort of work on programming mathematical routines, or how was it changing?
I got into a group that was doing the biggest computer program that we had, which was a simulation of the Atlas missile doing various different things. And so in this particular case, after various kinds of experiences of people coming and asking about doing things with different aspects of the inputs. So if you had different versions of the Rocketdyne engine that was being put on the Atlas missile, there were curves of thrust and fuel flow versus time that were varying at times, and sometimes they wanted the Rocketdyne A2, and sometimes they wanted the A3, and the like. And so what the engineers had done was to organize something that created several options for the key things that the rocket simulation needed. So fundamentally, one of them was propulsion. So you could say, yeah, we're going to do constant thrust and fuel flow, or we're going to do Rocketdyne A2 or A3, and as new ways to compute thrust and fuel flow came along, they just became another option that you could use. And similarly for aerodynamics, that basically you needed to have models of atmospheric density and pressure so that you could take compute lift and drag and all that sort of thing. So, so it was really impressive to see how they had really made life a lot easier for themselves by organizing this into sort of a modular kind of approach, which was when I got to Rand and did similar things, I was able to capitalize on what they had done. And yeah, some of the assignments were really stimulating things that a little later, after Sputnik and the like, the Atlas was chosen to be the rocket to put astronauts into space. And one of the things that they wanted to see if it would work was to put an escape tower on top of the rocket, so that the astronaut would be in the escape tower, and if something started going wrong with the main rocket, that they could hit a button on the escape tower and then it would get away before the thing blew up. And so I had the job of modeling the escape tower and its thrust and fuel flow and aerodynamics and guidance and control and all those sorts of things, and making sure that if they hit the button, it wasn't going to turn over and get hit by the rocket and that sort of thing. But fundamentally, yeah, the computations indicated that this was a feasible thing to do, and they said, yeah, let's put those on the Atlas missiles, and fortunately nobody ever had to use one of those.
Was there any, while you were doing this work, were you interacting at all with people doing the same sort of work in these other missile programs? I can't remember when it started, but I think at some point the MIT Instrumentation Laboratory gets going on Polaris. Maybe that's a little bit later. But then the people working on Titan and Minuteman, was there kind of a group of people doing this kind of computer work who exchanged ideas?
It's sort of interesting that, things like the ACM were starting to happen, but the first professional society that I joined was the American Institute of Aeronautics and Astronautics, and basically I was still thinking we'll get to Mars somehow and the like, and so the AIAA had a bunch of monthly meetings and was hosting a bunch of conferences, and so as a junior member I would get the job of meeting senior rocket scientists at the airport and driving them to the conference or things like that, and so it was a really stimulating thing. And just about every big aerospace company had its German rocket scientists, and General Dynamics had Kraft Ehricke, who was again big on doing the computations of going to Mars and back and the like. So I got to interact with him, and this was again a really stimulating kind of thing, and kept you thinking that maybe we'll get there after all.
And was that also a meeting ground where computer people in these aerospace projects could interact with one another specifically, as well with the broader community of aerospace types?
Well, that's one thing that I stumbled into was that, yeah, like ACM and IEEE, they had special interest groups, and then there was not a special interest group for aerospace computing. And I was in touch with some of the leaders in the AIAA and said, yeah, do you think we could do something like this? And there were some detractors that said, well, we don't have a special interest group for slide rules. I don't know why we need one for computers. And but fundamentally, what they asked me to do was to connect with some of these people that I would meet at these conferences and put together a special issue of the Society magazine on aerospace computing, and so we got some really good people to do that. One of them was Herb Grosch. I don't know if you know Grosch's law that basically says that how does it go? Well, it was basically that it was an early version of Moore's law that basically said that you only had to pay a square root for your next generation computer or something like that.
Wasn't Grosch's law sort of similarly to Moore's? I guess it was sort of economic in nature, but it seemed to imply that computation was more efficient, concentrated in large mainframes rather than distributed into smaller computers.
He was really a big mainframe guy. He was with General Electric at the time, but we got him to write an article in the special issue, and a whole bunch of other people put together some very interesting things, and so the society said, yeah, this looks like a viable thing to have a special interest group in, and so we went off and did that.
And just reflecting on, your comment about each of these big aerospace companies having their own German rocket scientist. I mean, and the person you interacted with having the Mars vision, sending a rocket to Mars. I mean, I thought, unless I'm mistaken, I believe that was a big theme for von Braun. I wonder if that German rocketry community, if that going to Mars with a rocket was a real common motivator for them.
Werner von Braun fundamentally didn't want to, as Tom Lehrer put it in his Werner von Braun song, said, "I make them go up. Who cares what where they come down? That's not my department," said Werner von Braun. But he was really more interested in conquering space and the like. So
interesting. Yeah. What was the reaction to Sputnik going up in the aerospace community in Southern California? What was that reaction like?
It was weird. Basically, as we were going back and forth in the carpool in the winter when it got dark early, you could look up and there was this thing going around, and that's not ours. It's a Russian Sputnik, and so the money faucets were turned up, and people said, yeah, we've got to get there too.
But Barry, my recollection was that they wanted physicists and chemists and mathematicians, and you didn't hear a whole lot of clamor for people who knew things about computers. It was before somehow there was a really good recognition that computers were central to all of this, as I recall.
Well, the kings at the big aerospace companies were really the rocket scientists, and the computer people were helping them analyze the problems that they encountered in terms of the Atlas was structurally impossible in that it had to be full of fuel to be able to escape being collapsed, and so you wanted to be as light as possible, and so having something that was sustained by the fuel inside it was a good thing. But there was one classic example of somebody doing a test where they were taking a rocket, an Atlas rocket on a truck across the desert, and somebody took a shotgun and shot a hole in it, and it went whoop. So it really did need all that stuff inside it to make it viable.
In addition to the use of the digital computers and software for simulation and engineering research and design, did you see or did you have exposure to any beginning use of the computer for the other aspects of these missile programs, like keeping track of the budget or keeping track of, the organization of the project or inventory, things like that, the more social organization of the projects?
It was such a big company that, I didn't have much connection with that, and it was really only when I got to Rand Corporation in 1959 that basically it was 1,000 people, and 200 of them were engineers, and then 200 of them were economists, and a whole bunch of physicists and cost analysts and things like that. So in that case, you really get exposed to the entire scope of things that people were using computers for.
I see. Well, maybe unless there's another aspect of your experience at Convair, maybe we could switch to the story of how you came to join Rand in 1959, I think it was.
Yeah, right. So again, I applied to UCLA and got accepted, and went and I really only interviewed at 3 places, and they all were willing to give me a job. But again, with the previous experience that I had with Rand and it being in Santa Monica and the like, basically was the deciding factor. And so I'll add a few things that are non-technical here, I guess. So I didn't have a security clearance when I went to Rand was doing a lot of high security kind of things, and they couldn't let you have an office in the main building until you got your security clearance to come through. And so they had a place in the basement called pre-clearance, and they would give you something unclassified to program and send it out there, and you would program away and then send them the code, and then so there were several people that were waiting for their clearances to come through, and one of them was a woman who was normally a high school math teacher at Santa Monica High School, and she wanted to do something different, and got a 1 year's assignment at Rand to program computers, and so again, she didn't have a clearance, and there we were down there in the basement, and we got to know each other, and she's now my wife. So,
Thank goodness for pre-clearance.
yeah, right. So, so at any rate, yeah, once the clearance came through, then there were different teams in the computer center. So there was an engineering team, which I was involved in. There was a physics team that was really doing more nuclear physics kinds of things, and there was an economics team and a business team, and so so basically, yeah, everybody was programming, but they were doing different kinds of it. And so this was an interesting situation when Rand decided that it would upgrade its computing, and that business people would want something that was good for databases and COBOL, and the engineering and physics people wanted something that was Fortran and a lot of computer cycles and the like. So yeah, so we had a complex set of comparison criteria for all of candidate computers, and we had to negotiate the weights of these and say how important is COBOL and how important is Fortran. So everybody really had to interact with each other and negotiate with each other about what was going to be important about the computing facilities. So you got to understand what all those other people were doing.
What was the resolution of that?
The resolution was an interesting counterexample. I ended up putting it in my software engineering economics book, in that after all of these things got weights and the like, compilers had 24% of the weight, and memory had 15% of the weight, and computing power had 28% of the weight, and things like that. And so basically, Honeywell and GE and all of the seven dwarfs had reasonably competitive computing, and IBM really had too. They had the what was best for us was the at the top of the line at the time, the Model 65, and they had just gotten the Model 67, which was doing virtual memory and the like, and because it had some of these more advanced features, it scored higher in some of the areas. And so basically when we did the weighted sum of the ratings for the different computers, the thing that came out on top was the 360 Model 67. And but once we started looking at it in more detail, we got these reports that it was spending most of its time talking to itself and paging and all of this kind of thing, and you were only going to get 15% of the computer cycles to do your Fortran or COBOL or whatever you wanted to do, and we went back and looked at this set of ratings and weights, and basically, the weight for the computing power was 27%, and there was only a weight of that 27%, only 3% of it was how much of the computing power is being soaked up by overhead, and in this case it was 80%, but the weight was 1% in terms of 27 times 3, so basically we ended up getting a Model 65.
You re-weighted it.
Yeah, right. And well, what I put into software engineering economics was that you really want to have a partly additive and partly multiplicative weighting function that said, the delivered system capacity is the sum of all these weighted things that are giving you features, and then the amount of cycles that you're actually getting is a multiplier of that, and the availability of the computer, if it took you a week to fix it, so these multiplicative factors would make a more realistic decision criterion than just the pure weighted sum kind of thing for computing anyway.
Did that sort of computer purchase decision methodology, did that travel widely? Did people follow your footsteps, other organizations, in doing that immediately, or is it something that you promoted?
Not immediately. So again, this was in the 60s, and the software engineering economics chapter was published in 1981, and after people saw that, and certainly when I was teaching software economics and teaching it to a bunch of people that were local employees and things like that, they sort of picked it up and that sort of thing.
My experience in the 60s was that everybody bought IBM because it was considered the safe choice. So people went through the exercise of weighting things and multiplying things, and then at the end, the IBM salesman somehow got the contract. Because the top level executives didn't want to take a chance on anything but IBM.
That was the case at the time, and it was interesting when I got to TRW. TRW was big on faxes and things like that, and but the business data processing people were all IBM, and we at one point tried to bridge the gap and said, let's let's see what we can do in terms of an integrated support environment that fits both the engineering and the business data processing. And we would ask the business data processing people, what should we do about a forms management system? And fundamentally, they would say, well, let us talk to our IBM people, and then they'll tell us what we ought to do about that. What we found was that they didn't have anything that was all that good, so we built our own and used it for configuration management, change control forms, or travel forms, or assessment forms, or things like that. So in 1982, it was the world's best forms management system. By 1986, it was still the worst. It was still the best 1982 forms management system. But we were amortizing it against one company, and then IBM and all the other companies were putting a lot more resources into building something that was better. So.
By that time, they realized that they were in the software business. So they, sometime in that period in the late 60s, 70s, early 80s, IBM realized that there was money to be made from software, and they started shifting their focus a bit. Although apparently, inside the company, it was quite a struggle.
Yeah, it definitely was, and you know, I can't remember. Were you on one of those committees with Fred Brooks? Because he
I'm
was.
sorry. What are those? Which
committees that said should we be doing about this aspect of computing?
No, I wasn't.
Well,
but I was following what was going on.
Yeah, but yeah, he had all sorts of stories about the hardware people versus the software people, and out came the mythical man month as a result.
Right.
Yeah.
Was there a sense that IBM was somehow gaming these weighted metric systems to come out on top?
Well, I don't think they needed to, because of what Lee was saying is that nobody's going to fire you for choosing IBM. And,
most they were extremely successful as marketeers. So this was back in the early 80s when I was a department chair, and the IBM salesman came to me and wanted to sell me I think it was a 3330. It was old, completely obsolete machine. He wanted to sell it to me for $1 million or something like that. And I threw him out of the office, and he went down to see the dean, and he offered to sell the dean 3 of them for $3 million. And the dean came up to see me, and he wanted to know why was I being so mean to the IBM? I was in Boulder at the time, and IBM had a big plant out there in Boulder. So I explained to him that it was an obsolete machine and they were taking advantage of us. And so the dean threw the guy out of his office, and then he went to the university, and he offered the president of the university 9 3330s for $9 million. And the president of the university checked with the dean, who checked with me, and the president of the university threw the salesman out. And doggone if he didn't go to the governor to complain about the president of the university. So that was one of the ways IBM, exerted his marketing dominance. And I remember telling an IBMer this story, with outrage in my voice. And the IBM guy, he just turned to me and he looked and he smiled and he said, "I sure am glad those marketing people are doing their jobs."
Well, I wanted to ask a few questions, if I could, about your experience at UCLA before talking about. I have some questions about RAND, but I know they're happening simultaneously. But maybe we could treat them separately. And just it was pursuing a PhD in mathematics at UCLA, and if you could tell us about the nature of your work there, what you were working on, what your thesis was about. And I was particularly interested to know if there was any connection to that National Bureau of Standards Western, well, I can't remember the operation that they had at UCLA.
So I knew a couple of the people that worked at that center, and Walt Karpeles and Jerry Estrin and people like that. But being a math major, I didn't really take any of their courses. I was interested in what they were doing. The thesis professor I had was somebody that I had worked with at General Dynamics in San Diego. He was hired to produce approximations for various functions that we needed to represent atmospheric density and pressure versus altitude, or those kind of things. And so he was very good at coming up with good, sometimes just polynomial approximations, but sometimes having sine or cosine functions in them, or the like. And so he got a job as a professor at UCLA, and I thought, well, I know him. He did practical work in approximation, and so he said, yeah, I'll take you on as a PhD student. But he had gone much more into theory, and fundamentally, he was not all that concerned about algorithms, and I was hoping to find the next great new set of algorithms for certain kinds of functions and the like. And he said, well, yeah, what I'm doing here is trying to generalize these things into if it's good for Euclidean space, is it good for non-Euclidean spaces, or Hausdorff spaces, or things like that. And so I labored away at trying to take the algorithms and abstract them into something that had much less strength and composability than the real number system does, and was able to show a few theorems that showed that you could, some of the approximation algorithms would work in more generalized spaces, but nobody had any physical problems that fit those spaces. So the title of my dissertation was Existence, Convergence of Best Rational Chebyshev Approximations. And I was able to split it up into three little subsystems that were published in mathematical journals. And that was the end of my mathematical approximation career. And except that, we still needed those things at Rand, and so basically when I got back, I was able to use things and use other people's algorithms and improve on them, but not really have any breakthroughs in approximation algorithms or anything like that. So,
were you able to concentrate on this work, or were you splitting your time between doing work at Rand and then work on your dissertation?
I think those of us that got PhDs in mathematics. Mine was in combinatorics, which is a little more applicable. But I think back in those early days in the 70s, when people like Dijkstra and Tony Hoare were, spouting mathematical formalisms, those of us who had PhDs in mathematics at least could understand what they were saying and had a better sense of what it was about, but what its limitations were, than a lot of other people that sort of fell into computing and software development without a firm mathematical background, who I thought were much more easily sort of knocked over and blown out of the way. So I never regretted having that mathematical background, because it allowed me to see what these other people were doing and what it was good for and what it wasn't good for.
Yeah, that's definitely true, and I found the same thing. And having conversations with Edsger Dijkstra and say, well, I know that testing only confirms the presence of errors but not their absence, but that's also true of proofs, and you can make mistakes in proofs. And he said, well, if you think hard enough, you can make a proof that it doesn't have errors in it. Well, if you think hard enough, you can probably do that with software. One of the really highlights of interacting with that group of people was in 1978, I think it was, the Électricité de France company did a summer school every year, and in some cases it was on electronic transmission or other kinds of things, but in this case it was software engineering, and they invited 3 people. One was Tony Hoare, one was a French abstract person, Jean-Raymond Abrial. I don't know if you remember him, Lee, but and then the other was me. And so basically each of us would have a lecture to do in the morning and a lecture to do in the afternoon, and people got this wide sweep of formality intensive or economics intensive kinds of ways of looking at software. And the other nice thing was that Tony Hoare and his wife were there with their kids that were aged 10, 12, and 14, and I was there with my wife, who our daughters were 11 and 13, and so we really sort of formed a family there for a while.
Did you participate in the first software engineering conferences in 1968 and 69?
I was aware of them, but I didn't participate in them.
Okay.
Yeah. So. Yeah. One person from RAND did. Jim Babcock, who eventually left RAND and formed a company called Allen Babcock that did time-sharing services and the like. But yeah, it was a landmark in the field. And,
and earlier we mentioned Fred Brooks and the Mythical Man Month, and in some of these analyses that you've done, you've talked about the sort of the switch in the cost between hardware to software. Sort of, this was a time where there was this talk about a software crisis. What was your view of that at the time?
Well, there were various aspects of the software crisis. There were, there aren't enough programmers to go around kind of crises. There were, nobody could get their mind around these big complex programs, and there are going to cover situations which could devastate the country, or collapse the stock market or things like that. And I remember one famous debate that I think it was 68 in London that Fred Brooks debated David Parnas on can we really trust the software of ballistic missile defense, and should we be investing in ballistic missile defense when we can't prove the correctness of the programs? And so Lee, were you in London for that one?
Oh yes, I have a distinct recollection of that. And you know, in retrospect, although at the time I thought Parnas was a very foolish man to come out so strongly against what the government was pushing so hard, in retrospect, I have more and more respect for him all the time, because I think, you know, software people who understand the limitations of these things that we build really need to stand up and say something about their limitations. And now with all this business about fake news and hacking and things like that, you know, I think we need more people with David Parnas' kind of guts to stand up and make a fool of themselves, but to get people back that be dangerous. So I remember XE8. I was not necessarily a big fan of David's at the time, but since then I've become a bigger and bigger fan of what he did.
Yeah, I was a fan ever since, I think it was XE3 in Atlanta, that he gave this talk about designing software for ease of extension and contraction, and saying, you know, you want to encapsulate the...
David, I'd like to throw in a story about Barry that he probably doesn't recall, but I think fits in very nicely. So you talked about making the transition from a hardware-oriented world to a software-oriented world, where software is the big thing and there's a crisis and so on. So this would have been around 1971, when I was a brand new PhD and I had just started my academic career at the University of Colorado. And I was sitting in my office. I had just gotten done with my PhD in combinatorics and had a strong interest in programming and in software and so on and so forth. Not sure what to do with my life and my career in a brand new computer science department that had, I think, 4 faculty members at the time. And in the fall of 1971 was delivered to my office a copy of Datamation magazine, which at the time was a serious publication venue. And in Datamation magazine was an article written by one Barry W. Boehm, and it was called CCIP 85, which was a study that he had done at RAND Corporation with some colleagues about what the shape of the computing world would be like in 1985, which was then 14 years in the future. And lo and behold, Barry had projected that by 1985, the current ratios of cost of hardware to cost of software would be completely turned upside down. So in 1971, hardware was 90% of the cost and software was a 10% afterthought. And Barry projected that in 1985, software would be 90% of the cost and hardware would be incidental 10%. And that was so heartening to some of us that we decided that this interest we had in software was probably a good thing to stick with. And it was absolutely formative for me. And I've often reminded Barry this, and in 1984 I asked him, would he be publishing a CCIP 99? And that's what he did. He laughed just exactly like that.
Well, yeah, basically, yeah, they didn't ask me in 1984, but yeah, I was at RAND, and the Air Force wanted to have this study done, and they asked an Air Force brigadier general who was the best software person they had, and he said, no, I've got another career thing I've got to do to make Major General, and So they asked Rand, did they have somebody who could run this? And they pointed to me, and so yeah, we had a group of people that was had representatives from the space community, the strategic air community, and the tactical air community, and a bunch of other people that were sort of contractor, engineer, analysts, and so we spent about a year going to the Strategic Air Command headquarters and seeing what they were doing with command and control, and Cheyenne Mountain, where they were doing the same thing for air defense, and Langley, Virginia, where they were doing a bunch of things for tactical air. So, and yeah, what we were finding in those areas, where originally people thought that the things that would be most needed in the mid '80s would be supercomputing and large screen displays, and what we were finding it was that these people were fighting software all the way, and the Strategic Air Command ended up with a command and control system that they had to rework 95% of to make useful. And they thought they were doing the right thing. Basically, they subcontracted it to RCA in New Jersey, and they sent a dozen Strategic Air Command people out to New Jersey to make sure that what the RCA people were programming was what the command and control system was actually supposed to do. And 2 years later, they finished the project and brought it back to Omaha, Nebraska, and basically said, "Oh, well, that's what we wanted 2 years ago, but the world has changed a whole lot in computing and strategic defense and offense and the like, and yeah, we can't use this." So there were software stories like that going on all over the place, and Cheyenne Mountain had situations where their computers were all in the middle of a mountain, and the humidity in these areas was rotting the computing equipment, and they were trying, but the worst things were really that they were ending up with languages like jovial and the like, that there weren't any there were no jovial programmers to carry on the tradition, and so we found that these organizations were really fighting software and not being able to do what they were hoping they could do in software. And that, yeah, part of it was requirements problems, part of it was reliability problems and the like. So we ended up with this report that, again, as Lee said, was that in each of these places they were spending more on hardware and less more on software and less on hardware, and there was this curve that if you extrapolated it, that it would end up going 90-10 rather than 10-90, and so again, yeah, the other thing that was nice was that, yeah, we had some companies that would do various studies for us, and then some of the companies had some data about what what was happening to their productivity, or what kind of things would make it more expensive to produce, and the like. So all of this hit the field at just about the right time, and datamation was something that most of the people in the computing field felt was sort of the it wasn't a professional journal, it was a commercial trade journal, but somehow or other that article took off. Yeah.
It really was remarkable. I think it really, if you trace it back, it had an incredibly formative effect. I mean, there was no software engineering discipline as a whole. There were no software engineering journals. There was some suspicion that software was anything at all. I recall going to ICSE 2, which was the second international conference on software engineering in San Francisco, and I can't remember who it was. I think it was the guy from Edinburgh. I can't remember who it was. And then somebody asked him, what did he think of software development and software engineering? And he frowned and he said, I think software is just mostly a form of low cunning. It wasn't a serious thing. But then Barry and just a very small number of other pioneers grabbed a hold of it and pointed out that it not only was it a serious thing, but it was a serious problem. It really made a tremendous difference.
Low cunning sounds like Morris Wilks. I think I remember him saying something like that.
I think you're right. I think it was Wilks. Yeah.
So, some other challenges that software had at the time was that it was invisible. And one Air Force general that was commissioning software basically said, you software guys are like the weavers in the story about the Emperor's New Clothes, who said, we are going to provide you with the most spectacular costume that kings have emperors have ever worn, and all you have to do is give us some silver and golden thread, and we will create this for you. So he would come by every once in a while, and there they would be doing weaving and wefting and the like, but there wasn't anything in the middle of the weaving machine. And he said, it's coming along wonderfully. Just wait, and you'll see how glorious it is to put it on. And so again, they declared victory and left the country as quickly as they could. And the emperor went down the street with no clothes on, and everybody bowed except for a little 4-year-old girl who said, "The emperor has no clothes." And this general said, "You software guys are sort of like those weavers. I can't. There's no tires to kick or anything like that. I go in and they say it's going fine. We're weaving away at this magic cloth." And so it was a hard thing to communicate with people about what it was all doing.
Do you remember when the term software engineering started coming up, and also what did it mean to you at the time?
Well, I think the NATO books having that on their cover was really the main thing that got everybody saying, that we know it's an aspiration rather than a mature discipline, but we need to get it to be more like physical engineering, there were a bunch of other trends that were happening during the 60s that complicated things. One was really that we ran out of engineers to turn into computer software engineers, so people had to hire music majors and art majors and philosophy majors and the like, so you got in a lot of cases people that didn't really want to act like engineers and would end up creating interesting stuff, but it wouldn't do the job, and it wouldn't interact with anybody else's software and the like. So I think I did this one paper that Lee actually commissioned me to do as a keynote at ICSI 2006 in Shanghai, that basically said, yeah, is there a way we can explain the evolution of emphases in software? And what I found was that there is this Hegelian approach to philosophy that says basically somebody presents a thesis, and then somebody else presents an antithesis, and then somebody converges that into a synthesis, and that becomes a thesis that somebody comes up with an antithesis. And so in the 50s, the thesis was you should engineer software like you engineer hardware. And then in the 60s, with all the art and music majors and the like, they said, no, it's a craft. It's not an engineering discipline. You need to be inspired and to do it well and the like. And then the NATO thing said, no, you've got to turn it around and make it more engineering-like. And so there was this sort of thesis, antithesis, synthesis kind of thing that was going on across the decades. Yeah, there was a Dogstool week on the history of software engineering, and we were trying to figure out, can we explain why it went the way it did?
Can I ask one more?
Please.
Yeah.
Earlier you mentioned Dijkstra.
Mm-hmm.
When did you first interact with him or meet him, and what did you think of the things that he was advocating, structured programming and program correctness, and the usefulness of those approaches?
Yeah, as part of the follow-up to the Datamation, the study that led to the Datamation article, I did try to help the Air Force determine, what should be in their research program, and one of the things that was really important was trying to make it more reliable, and so I went to the Netherlands and had an afternoon with Edsger Dijkstra, and I think what he had was really a lot of really good ideas, but he had sort of a limited sphere of experience, and I would ask him a question, and there would be silence for about 2 minutes, and then out would come this 2-minute lecture, wonderfully organized, thoroughly thought through, and gave you more than you thought you could get as an answer. But it was sort of an interesting afternoon going through this kind of. I found that most of his examples were fairly formal kind of examples of what people did for programming, and that if you were trying to develop programs to help educate people or help people negotiate things or the like. There were a lot of human unexplainables that trying to formalize the requirements and address building a computer program that satisfied the requirements was not the solution. A lot of times it was prototyping this and prototyping that and saying, is this going to satisfy people and the like. At one point, he did one of his favorite EWD notes and said, I have just reviewed this paper on human-computer interaction, and you can't formalize it. And if you can't formalize it, it has no business being in software engineering. So again, that's one definition of software engineering, and unfortunately, some people really sort of, well, he himself basically said, just getting the program right is about as much as my brain can do. So I don't think software people should really think about the requirements. I think they should let somebody else give them the requirements, and then you can get your head around that and produce what they asked for. But again,
I wasn't in NATO meetings either, but I've read the proceedings pretty carefully because I think I did a panel session on the NATO conference, and I'm not sure whether you have the same recollection or the same reconstruction of history as this, but my sense is that the 1968 NATO conference basically pitted the United States against the Europeans, and there was a deep philosophical rift. The Europeans were strongly influenced by Dijkstra and by Tony Hoare and people like that, who felt that this was serious mathematics and it was heavy-duty stuff and all of the things that you just said. But the Americans came in impatient at, we've got to write programs, we've got to fly missile planes, and we got to get stuff done. And in 1969, when they got back together again for the second meeting in Rome, my understanding is that it was pretty ugly, that there was abuse on both sides, and in fact there wasn't another international software engineering for at least another 4 years. So I think you and I were both at that meeting in New York in 1973, and I had no idea what was going on. I just knew that there were a lot of people that were very mad at each other.
right.
And you know, I can almost trace to this day the fact that there's a European view of software engineering that's much more mathematical and much more formal, and then there's an American view that seems to be much more pragmatic. I think the difference is much harder to detect right now, but certainly in France, there's hardly any practical software engineering education that goes on. It's all mathematical and very formal.
So yeah, I think that's definitely the case, and it's, although there are exceptions. The Scandinavians, I think, are much more people-oriented.
Yeah. You have that recollection of the early days after those software engineering, the NATO meetings, that there was an American side and a European side, and they really didn't seem to see eye to eye at all.
Yeah, there were some exceptions. Again, my experiences with Tony Hoare and the French summer school and things like that got me to appreciate what he could contribute, and I think got him to appreciate what American perspectives could contribute. So again, I think he has been one of the more practical people, and certainly when he got left Oxford and went to Microsoft and said, yeah, let's see what we can do to make things more rigorous than they have been.
Well, one quick question about your Air Force study circa 1970.
Yeah.
It seems like the problem or the causes for the cost dominance of software that you were getting at, to me, strike me, hearing you describe them, as more about more social problems or organizational problems than something that is fundamentally a technical challenge. You know, it's not like solving Fermat's last theorem. It's not like making fusion energy. It's more, you know, the dynamics of a large process involving lots of organizations and changing conditions on the ground. Is that a fair characterization?
That's a fair characterization of some aspects of the situation. I think one of the other economic trends that really pushed people more toward software was really when you could do electronic upgrades of software. In 1960, an Air Force plane, about 10% of the functionality was done in software. But a lot of the other things were done by pneumatics or hydrodynamics or mechanical linkages and things like that. And if you wanted to or needed to upgrade your system, fundamentally you had to get each individual plane and go off and fix it. People found that there were ways to build these airplane buses that you could send electronic signals around, and for a lot of the things that you wanted to change the functionality, it was easy to just change the software once and then send it off to upgrade all the fleet. So by 2000, 80% of the functionality in an airplane was being done by software, and one general said about the only thing we can do with an F-16 without software is to take a picture of it. So again, yeah, I think it's gone up over 90% for the F-22 and the F-35 and the like.
Yeah, there's it just seems there's so many, most of what you read about that F-35 aircraft is about software.
Yeah, right.
Well, if I could, I'd like to direct us back to some developments during your tenure at RAND that I thought were very interesting, that I think that you were involved with. Before asking you about one that I know that you were involved with, the rocket simulation program, I did want to ask you about the RAND tablet and that whole development, which Hansen and I have recently learned about from Alan Kay, who sings its praises dramatically. And I wondered if you could tell us a little bit about your experience of the RAND tablet effort.
Sure, yeah. So basically, what it enabled you to do is to write on a tablet, and if you had a good character recognition piece of software, you could get it so that people could work it pretty well. At the time, Rand was looking for ways to apply the tablet to help get various kinds of jobs done, and so we had this rocket program, and fundamentally it was something where you put a bunch of inputs in and a bunch of outputs out, and then you got a bunch of stacks of paper that showed you what the trajectory was like and how accurate it was and things like that. Between Tom Ellis, who was the guy who really invented the way the tablet worked, and Gabriel Groner, who built the character recognition system, and Keith Unkefer, who was the head of the part of RAND that was doing all this stuff for DARPA, said, why don't we build a graphic version of the rocket program? So we will put the input forms on the screen, and people can write the takeoff weight and the atmospheric model they wanted, and the thrust and fuel flow model they wanted, and the like, and the system would chunk away, and in front of your eyes there was the trajectory of the rocket going the way you wanted, or in some cases the rocket program would allow you to do trade-off studies and say, so suppose that we had let's try different engines and see which one does the best job of meeting the range criteria, and so you'd get 4 things going along, and you could see which one got the farthest and the like, and this was something that the RAND rocket engineers liked a lot, and it.
Sorry.
Yeah.
Lee's back.
Barry is back. Yeah. Basically what we ended up doing and trying to publicize it was doing some UCLA short courses on graphical methods of rocket engineering and the like, and surprisingly, well, there were a couple of places that were doing similar things. That Lockheed had a group in Georgia that had built something that was optimized around Lockheed products, but it could give you graphs of performance and
on a screen.
Yeah. But fundamentally, the RAND engineers were doing their work on a 360 Model 50 that DARPA had paid for, and so it was free for them. But if you wanted to hire an hour of 360 Model 50 time, it would cost you $50. And so outside of RAND, it didn't really have a big market. The thing that was interesting was that we had done it in a way that that you had different modules for entering the inputs and displaying the outputs and doing various kinds of comparisons and the like. And so there were other people at RAND that had similar problems. There were people that were doing complex medical analyses and saying, well, yeah, what we want to do is to see if we are feeding this person this kind of medication for at this rate and this other kind at this other rate, is it going to lead to something that makes them more healthy or less healthy or and the like. And it was the same basic problem that you wanted to put in the rates here with your little handwriting and see the curves with it. So we did find that we had created a GUI builder, and we didn't realize that GUI builders were anything that people worried about them till a few years later. And again, it was a non-economic GUI builder for anybody outside of RAND, but it served a pretty good purpose. Yeah, we called it program-oriented graphic operation, or POGO.
I had that on the question list. I hadn't realized that it was.
And we wanted to put a Walt Kelly POGO, and we got this nasty letter from his publisher. You can't do this. Yeah.
So this effort from this whole effort around the RAND tablet and its various uses, did this run across the 60s, or because POGO was 67, is that right? Somewhere around there?
That's about it, 67, 68.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So it must have been running for several years before. So it's the mid 60s was this effort, would you say?
Yeah.
Okay. So this is, and when does the whole activity start up at Utah in computer graphics? Around the same
late
time,
60s.
is it not?
Yeah.
It was around the same, it was basically when Simon Sutherland left DARPA and went to Utah.
Right.
Because, again, he was sponsoring that kind of stuff when he was at DARPA, and he was doing that stuff at MIT before he went to DARPA to sort of evangelize doing more and more of this, and getting DARPA to sponsor more and more computer graphics technology.
So was Ivan Sutherland sponsoring the RAND tablet work? I see. I hadn't made that connection before. Okay. That makes perfect sense.
Yeah, right.
Another thing I wanted to ask you about RAND was this, if it is also a fair characterization, that had this interesting mix of, from the outside, it seems like it had an interesting mix of being closed and open, that in that there are certain activities that were very academic, if you will, publishing, presentations, mixed with kind of work that by its nature had to be closed for military work or government work. Is that, I don't know, I think that's an interesting mixture. I wondered what you thought about that.
Well, it sort of reached almost a crisis point when RAND decided to create a domestic studies division. And the Air Force said, you're the Air Force's think tank. We don't want all your smart people to go off and solve New York City's housing problems and firefighting problems and things like that. And it's going to be too hard to separate the organization into an unclassified bunch of people and a classified bunch of people. And so it did, there were parts of RAND that were doing domestic studies, and they couldn't penetrate the other part of RAND. And people would get together for lunch and things like that, but it was a problem. And also at about the same time, Daniel Ellsberg decided to release the Pentagon Papers, and RAND was really in the doghouse as far as supporting the Defense Department after that. So it could have been an existential moment for RAND that it might not survive all of this. But eventually, RAND did a good job in getting a bunch of really influential people on its board of trustees that would if the Air Force generals were getting too feisty about something, they could go to the Secretary of Defense and say, can we talk to these people for a bit and then see if there's some more constructive way we can move along and that sort of thing. So I think those kind of things helped the Air Force get what it wanted, and the Domestic Studies Division people got what they wanted.
Was there any? Were there tensions within RAND about the work being done for maybe the military more broadly during Vietnam? How was that? What was the experience of like that from inside the organization?
I think for most people, Vietnam was not at the center of their attention. It was mostly the people that got, like Ellsberg and Amram Katz and the like, who went over and said, how can RAND wisdom conquer the Viet Cong and the like, and finding that they really had no solutions. And saying, this whole war makes no sense, it didn't really, the average RAND person didn't really worry much about it, except for the fact that the company might go out of business. There were other people that were uncomfortable about RAND analyses. Herman Kahn did these things about the megadeaths, and how can you talk about people that way? It just I know you're just trying to be engineering and scientific and algorithmic about different kinds of ballistic missile offenses and defenses and casualties and the like, but this is inhuman. A bunch of people didn't associate with other people. Richard Bellman was a good example. He invented dynamic programming, but he was a pure mathematician. He tried to apply dynamic programming to all sorts of medical problems and things like that, and said, yeah, I'm out to try to make people healthy rather than kill them, and
Right.
I don't really want to talk to this guy. And so there were things like that were going on inside the company.
Where did you find yourself?
I must confess that in a couple of the system analyses that I did in trying to optimize, where would you want to put your satellites and things like that. I never counted casualties or anything like that, but basically said, here are the places that if you wanted to drop something that had an electromagnetic pulse that shut down all of the military facilities. Here's the way you would configure your satellites and the like. But that's about as close to that kind of stuff as I got.
And I did some oral history interviews with Jay Last, who was one of the people responsible for the silicon integrated circuit, and which was, of course, part and parcel of this missile work, ICBM work, and in those interviews he made a point to say you also have to understand that it was a scary time on the world scene, so that's not to be forgotten as a context.
Yeah, and I got involved in the ARPANET basically because of some of those kind of things. That the Minuteman missiles had various kinds of communications support things that were basically wires, and so there were concerns that if either airplanes or missiles came along and cut the wires between these things, that they couldn't receive their messages to fire or things like that. And so the packet switch network approach looked like it might be a good solution for that, and I got involved in analyzing those kind of things. Coincidentally, it was my wife who was the key contributor to this, and Paul Barron was the engineer who was doing this series of 14 reports that said, here's how you can do packet switch networking, and here's how you can reassemble the messages at the other end, and here's how you can transmit things, and here's how you can worry about overloads and the like. And so she was programming during this year, and Paul Barron said, I need somebody to simulate these and make sure that this kind of routing is going to succeed. And so she produced something, and basically showed that it could address all of the potential problems using the kind of algorithms or some variations of some algorithms that. And Paul was a nice guy, and he named her the first author of that report. And so she really has a minor place in the history of the ARPANET and the internet and the like. So.
What is her name? I'm sorry, I don't know.
Charla. I'll give you a website. There's a guy who I think he calls himself the software curmudgeon or something like that, and he was surfing the internet and he found this set of Paul Barron things and found this one by this woman that did this analysis and was the lead author of it, and said, put this blog out that says, "Who in the heck is Charla P. Boehm?" And so eventually I got wind of it and looked at it and responded to him and said, yeah, that's what she did, and here's some more about her and the like, and he added to his blog, and so it's something that's, if the Computer History Museum is interested in women in computing,
absolutely,
this would be something that you might be interested in looking at. Yeah,
very much so. So just so she did a simulation of a packet switch network along the lines that Barron was proposing, and saw that it had
you could make it work. Yeah.
Wow. And did she, for her professional career, was she at Rand for her whole run, or I guess I could talk to her?
No, she was going to go to Rand in 1958, and she had also applied to teach Air Force dependents in England, and decided, well, I'll spend a year and live in London and teach Air Force dependents. But they gave her another year off from the high school, and so she did a year at Rand. And then I think at summers she would go back and do some programming and the like. So,
was it in one of these summers that she did this?
I think it was.
Network?
Yeah, it was more in the early '60s rather than late '50s. And,
right.
And then we had our first daughter in 1965, and she decided that she'd stop teaching, she'd stop programming, be a Girl Scout leader and things like that. So. Yeah.
Thank you. Well, I would love to see that.
Okay.
I guess.
I do have I have a question about Systems Development Corporation and the work that they did on Sage rapidly expanded the number of software programmers. Did you have any relationship to that?
Some, and so again, I interviewed for them, and they offered me a job, and I got an idea of what Sage was all about, and then fundamentally, I stumbled across a couple of papers that one Herb Bennington had done in 1956 that basically said, here's the waterfall model. 14 years before Winston Royce wrote the waterfall model paper, we succeeded at this because we were all engineers, and so again, this was sort of the initial thesis that says, if you want to get good software, get engineers to produce it, and then there was another paper by a guy named Bill Hosier who went through a bunch of difficulties that they had and what kind of lessons learned there were from these. And what I did in 1979 was to Lee, this was the year that you did your software processes or software 2 thing. I had a session that was sort of let's look back at the history and see what Herm Bennington and Winston Rice and one of the other System Development Corporation people, Pat Haverty, did the Hosier article because he wasn't available then. But
86 or 87,
yeah. Yeah, and so basically all of the lessons learned in this were still lessons learned in the late 80s. And so what I was trying to do with this session and this article was to say, yeah, these are good things, but yeah, that was published in 1961. Now, how come we've gone another 15 years and still haven't learned the lessons?
Right. And it gets republished every couple of more years because the lesson still hasn't quite been learned and the solution hasn't been found. But I mean, from some point of view, it suggests that software engineering has got some deep and enduring problems that have not quite actually been crystallized yet. But they're deep and enduring because people keep trying and not quite figuring out how to do these things right.
Yeah, it's one of the things that we are currently doing at USC is building these technical debt analyzers that fundamentally look for bad smells in your software and dead code and duplicate code that's if you want to modify it, you better remember where you put all the other copies and things like that. These are becoming really valuable, and so we've been doing a deep dive on technical debt and software maintainability, and one of the things that we found was that many of the main sources of technical debt are non-technical. And we have a top 10 list of non-technical sources of technical debt, like the conspiracy of optimism, basically. The people that are wanting to get their program funded from the government in the Air Force or the Navy or the Interior Department or wherever, and so they tend to be optimistic about what they can do for a given budget, and they know they've gotten themselves into a tight situation. So a lot of government agencies still use the successful bidder criterion of we are going to award this project to the lowest cost technically acceptable bidder. And so if you do a cost estimate and you say this is going to cost $10 million, and you know that if you bid $10 million, somebody is going to underbid you. So you try to be optimistic about saying, well, if we get the A team for this, and all the COTS products interoperate, and all those kinds of things, we can get it done for $7 million. And then we have this thing called the cone of uncertainty that basically says, before you build it, you really don't know exactly how these things are going to do, and it could cost you 10, it could cost you 20, it could cost you 5, and the only way that you're going to find out exactly what it's going to cost is at the end. And so what people tend to do in the conspiracy of optimism is to choose the lower thing of the cone of uncertainty, and and get the bad news as they go along. A good example is the F-22. That when they started, they were going to build 750 airplanes for $26 billion. And now what they have is 187 airplanes, or a quarter as many airplanes for $78 billion, or 3 times the price. So it's a factor of 12 that happened there. And if your software is going to end up in situations like that, well, the first thing that hits you is really the system engineers don't have an adequate budget. And so they're going to do a poor job of system engineering, and all of that is going to become what one of our other professors calls architectural debt, and all of that translates into software debt. But it's a non-technical source of technical debt.
Hmm. Why the choice of the term debt for that?
This was something that Cunningham, when he was doing Agile methods, found that in order to get something done quickly, it was worth deferring certain testing and careful buddy checking or inspections or things like that. And in those cases, that may be for a good reason, because you want to be first to market, or you want to get the devices out that are killing soldiers with improvised explosive devices and things like that. And so basically, you say, I'm willing to postpone fixing these things, but what Ward Cunningham found was the situation was that the more he put it off, the more expensive it became to fix, and that it was acquiring interest on the debt.
Interesting.
So that's where the
I see now.
analogy came from. Yeah.
Is this a good time to talk about sort of the history of these sorts of engineering processes, waterfall and spiral model and Agile, and go over that?
Sure.
Sure.
I mean, Barry would know better.
Yeah. So again, one of the things that I really enjoyed was working with Winston Royce, who everybody looks at that and says, what he was trying to get everybody to do was to do a one pass through and don't think about the design until you finish the requirements, because you'll be contaminating the requirements by pre-deciding the design, and don't do the design, don't do any coding until you finish the design, and for the kind of things that TRW was doing up here in Sunnyvale was keeping track of satellites, and the satellites are very deterministic, and all the equations are well understood, and the like, and so you can do requirements, then design, and then code, and then test, and it works pretty well. But what Win and the rest of TRW were finding was that as projects became more human intensive, that you had to get the user interfaces right and things like that, and that you couldn't really write down what what should you put on the screen to make sure that the people make the right decision about the situation. And so we at TRW started investing a lot in rapid prototyping technology and the like, and that this isn't really waterfall. And what in various conversations we came up with was that what was really happening was that there was a lot of uncertainty going on, and that prototyping was doing was an aspect of statistical decision theory that said you're buying information to reduce risk, and that's fundamentally what got the spiral model going, was to say, and what when Rice really said in that 1970 article was not there's just one path. He did say you ought to be doing prototyping, and then there's this secondary thing that says build a piece of it and see if it's going in the right direction, and then go back and do the waterfall. And what the spiral model was doing was trying to formalize that and say that what you want to do is look for the uncertainties that you're not sure about, and uncertainties are probabilities of loss, and probability of loss times size of loss equals risk exposure, and the big risk things are the things that you ought to be buying information to reduce risk. And sometimes they're user interface things, sometimes they're scalable algorithms and the like, but sometimes they're scalability of COTS products or interoperability of COTS products. And so basically, before you embark on some risky requirements, you should buy some information and see whether that's the right way to go or not. And so that's what the spiral model was trying to do. Unfortunately, the original spiral model paper tried to compress all of these things into a single diagram, and it was easy to misinterpret the diagram as saying that what you're doing is exploring the identifying the needs and opportunities and risks, and resolving the risks, and then going around in the spiral. So yeah, if you want some entertainment, just Google on samples of spiral model diagrams, and you'll find the craziest bunch of things that So yeah, we went through various iterations of the spiral model. We called it the win-win spiral model for a while, because we were also trying to negotiate win-win conditions among the various stakeholders in the project. But we eventually converged on the incremental commitment spiral model, which is the title of the latest book that defines what it is. And so that tries to address what happened after rapid prototyping and buying information to reduce risk, was that the Agile methods kind of things started coming up, and that again, what we try to do in teaching software engineering at USC is to I have people get together in 6-person teams and meet with a client that they've never seen before and build them a piece of useful software. And so fundamentally, they therefore know where the requirements come from. They do an initial get together in a room that is orchestrated by a professor in the business school who is just super at getting people to quickly understand each other, and she calls on them and says, yeah, tell me what you did about learning what the problem was and learning what the solution was, and then 2 days after that, they have to go and visit their client's facility and see what are they doing and what do they want to do better, and who are the people that are involved, and the like. So basically, we apply the spiral model in doing all of those courses and debug it as we go along, and so one of the things that we found that was a problem was that our documentation got super heavy, and that we really ought to, if we're going to teach people how to do 21st century software, we should be teaching them Agile methods. And so fortunately, at the time, I was writing a column for IEEE software, and got connected with some of the Agile people to write some pieces and say what were they trying to do, and really learned a lot from what they were trying to do, and said that it's something we should be teaching our students much more about, but it doesn't cover everything, and so there are other aspects that we found, like trying to converge on people understanding each other's problems and solutions before you go off and lay the first line of code and the like. So we have a negotiation groupware tool called it's gone through 6 iterations. It was called Easy Win-Win for a while, and now it's called WinBook because it looks like Facebook, and the clients can use it more easily, and the like. And so basically, what the developers and clients and the clients' maintainers do is to say, as an architect, I want the system to be able to address scalability up to the kind of things that you need. And the clients say, as a client, I need to, I run a community service organization, and I need to keep track of my events and my volunteers and my finances and my donors and things like that. So basically, what they do is find things that if they agree with them, then it becomes a requirement. If they disagree, it becomes an issue, and they need to come sort of do some kind of horse trading that gets them to something that is a win for both of them, and that they're better off than they would have been otherwise. So nobody gets everything they want, but everybody gets something better than what they have. So again, all of that is really saying that just getting a bunch of people around and doing a 30-day sprint and then saying, yeah, is that what you want? What do you want next? And it's sometimes works, but sometimes gets people, as Ward Cunningham found, in increasing technical debt, because they will go off in a different direction in the next sprint, and getting the things to complement each other isn't as easy as it might look. And
what other sort of strengths and versus weaknesses between waterfall and spiral and agile, these different models, do you think that there are? How can we improve on these processes?
Yeah. So what we found was that the latest version of the incremental commitment spiral model basically says what you're going to do is elaborate the definition of the system one more time and determine and show evidence that if you build it to the architecture that you're proposing, here's the evidence that it will be buildable in the budgets and schedule in the plan, and satisfy the requirements, and satisfy all of the stakeholders' needs. And so if the evidence is insufficient, basically you have an uncertainty or a probability of loss, and again, multiplying that by size of loss gives you risk. And so you basically say, as a stakeholder, do you accept this level of risk? And if everybody agrees, then you go forward. In some cases, again, you may say, I need to get to market quickly, and I'm willing to leave the risks there and build up some technical debt. And so there's really, out of each one of these decision points, you can either go forward into the next phase, or you can say, this is a medical product that needs to be safe, and we haven't done enough safety analysis, and we should do that before we commit to this particular architecture. Or you can find that you thought you were going to be first to market, but there's already 3 companies that have 80% of the market share, and so you want to have an off-ramp that says it's better off to drop this project and save your resources for a more competitive project. Or you can have a situation in which your evidence is that you're building a small system for somebody to keep track of their donors and the like, and there's an enterprise resource planning system that their company has a subscription to, and they've built more complex things than this using the ERP system. So you really don't need to go into another phase that is going to do a business case, because you already own the thing, and it has done bigger projects, and you don't need to do an architecture analysis because the architecture supported a more complex thing. And so in those kind of cases, you can say, yeah, we don't need any more upfront stuff. We can just go do sprint 1, and we know there's a low risk of this running into problems, that sort of thing. So what we've done, basically, there are 3 definition phases and 4 ways out of each one. So there's 4 cubed or 64 different ways that you can go through this, and that's too many. So what we've done is to identify some common cases and say, here are half a dozen decision criteria that say how big is this system and how complex is it, how critical is it safety critical, or is it just something that's going to give you a loss of comfort if your video game crashes or something like that. How COTS intensive is the system? How capable are the people in being able to do this kind of thing? There's one more criterion, but basically, how volatile are the requirements? So if you have a situation where the worst requirements, volatility things are in mergers and acquisitions, where people try to merge their corporate infrastructure software, and every week they find some new problem that says, yeah, we can't write the requirements for this thing, and we'll be rewriting requirements all our life rather than building something that gets closer and closer to what we need. So again, what we found is that for various settings of if the system is small and it's low to medium criticality, and your people are Agile experienced and the requirements are volatile, you ought to do pure Agile. Just don't try to write any requirements. Just do a piece and get back to the clients and say, well, what are the top priority things in your backlog, and let's do those for the next piece. And if it's something that is a little bit bigger and a little bit more critical, we say, and a bunch of companies have done this very effectively, there's something called architected Agile that basically says before you do a programming sprint, you do an architecture sprint, and you make sure that fundamentally what you choose in terms of architectural structures and choices of COTS products or cloud services or things like that are going to be satisfactory and scalable enough to satisfy this system, and then you can go Agile from there. Right? So there's about a dozen of those special cases, and if you're migrating from some horrible combination of legacy software, then there's a special kind of thing, a different kind of process that you do for that. And if you're doing something that's security critical, and then you need to use formal methods and the like. So again, it's trying to come up with something that is not perfect, but gets you pretty close to where you want to be in terms of what you want to do next and the like.
Just one more?
Sure.
Yeah. Another thing that has been, I guess, more in the past, but sort of there was one strategy for maybe improving software engineering was to build certain techniques into the tools or into programming languages like structured programming or object-oriented programming. How have these attempts, sort of technical solutions, actually worked? And to improve things versus how much have they fallen short in solving the problems?
Well, I think what happens is that, yeah, if you have a mature domain and one that's not too complex, that's what all these enterprise resource planning kind of things will do for you. They say that there's a pretty safe architecture for doing these kind of things. There are ways that SAP or Oracle or the like can be, it will give you some tailoring languages so you can tailor the things to what your processes are, and you can tailor the reports to what your reports need to be, and the like. And so those are really sort of a spectacular win for that kind of thing. But there are still problems that are beyond our ability to really come up with packaged solutions or something other than just feeling your way. I think the biggest examples are crisis management systems that say we got to do better than Katrina or Puerto Rico or the like. But in those cases, you really have a lot of people that come out of different cultures. They have made different choices of architectures and data structures and things like that, and they have different. The police are trying to reduce crime, and the firefighters are trying to get the fires out, and then the hospitals are trying to get the people healthy again, and they even within those areas they have incompatible data management systems and communication systems and the like, and so those, I think, are really sort of the challenges for the future. Is how can you build one of these, and so in the incremental commitment spiral model book, we have an example of a medical first responder system that tries to say, here's one way that you could get through these, but it doesn't really, in a 250-page book, solve the crisis management system architecture problem or anything like that.
Well, I just wanted to, in the time that we have remaining with you, I did want to ask you about your.
I hope that isn't reverberating too much.
Yeah. Well, well, I did want to talk about your tenure at TRW, and just your, your overall experience there, and then make sure to have a chance to talk about your service with DARPA.
Okay.
And the move to USC. I thought, well, to start that, maybe we could talk about your, what led you to shift from RAND to TRW in the early 70s.
Well, it was basically that that CCIP 85 study said, that software is going to be a real complex problem to try to get your arms around and try to, quote, solve. And the biggest software project at RAND had 4 programmers on it. So basically what I felt I needed to do was to go to a place that did a whole lot of software, and so I sort of re-engaged with System Development Corporation and what Raymond Wooldridge had become, which was TRW, And yeah, fortunately, TRW was saying, we really feel that we need to get more up to speed in our software technology, and this came right after the Datamation article, which basically gave me a little bit of credibility, and so they said, yeah. We would like you to be our Director of Software Research and Technology. And fundamentally, what this involved was taking an inventory of what they had done, which was a lot of really good stuff. So they had a bunch of tools that they had built that helped you organize testing better and count the number of branches that had been exercised in the tests and the number of instructions that had been in, and then if you could get to 100%, then you felt that things were pretty well tested and the like. We had gone from manual standards checking to having some automated standards checkers and some other things that we had gotten from other places that had good approaches to doing requirements. Dan Tycro had something called PSA, Problem Statement Language and Analyzer, that we got a lot of value out of. And so, since I'd had all of this opportunity at courtesy of the Air Force to go around and see what everybody was doing, I could bring some stuff in and capitalize on the stuff that was there, and respond to needs that the company said that they needed. So, for example, we had capitalized on the Win Royce waterfall article and said, yeah, we are your software developer of choice because we are masters of the waterfall model. What happened was that, we were using it in Sunnyvale and a couple other places, but there were other customers who said, you're not doing that on our project. Why aren't you doing this on our project? Mm-hmm. And so our division general manager said, we need to have a set of TRW policies and standards that say, this is the waterfall model and this is how you do software at TRW. And so we went through a process over a year that converged on about 20 policies and 300 pages of standards and the like, and went through an education process where we first educated all the department heads to see what it was all about, and then had them teach all of the people in their departments about it, and followed that up with a 40-question analog to the California driver's test that says, true, false. If you don't get 35 of these right, you can't drive a software system at TRW. And what we had unfortunately done was brainwash people into using the waterfall model. Oh. And then when we started getting these user-intensive decision support systems, you really didn't want the waterfall. You wanted prototyping and things like that. So it was a real challenge to try to change the culture back again. Basically, people said, you can't do the prototyping on that project because that's programming before the critical design review, and we can't do that. It's illegal, immoral, and unethical. And, it took a while, but we did finally get the best of both worlds, and redid the policies and standards really around a more risk-driven approach, and so that helped a lot. And I found that my job would take big changes like that every once in a while, and one of the next ones was the division general manager called me into his office and said, over the past 3 weeks, I've had to sign off on projects that committed us to build software for $50 million each. And nobody could tell me why it wasn't $25 or $75 million. And we got to be able to do better than this. And so that was really sort of the beginning of the COCOMO cost model.
Right.
Since he was the division general manager, he could lean on people to give us data to calibrate a model, and he could lean on parts of the company to give us smart people to converge on what the cost drivers were for the model. And so finally we got 20 projects, and found that with the data that we had, we could calibrate them to the parametric model that the team of experts put together. And so that was a really good thing for the company. Unfortunately, we would send in a proposal and say, we have this much higher level of assurance than other people do about the cost that we're bidding, because we have estimated it with the COCOMO model, which is TRW proprietary. And the customers would say, well, we need something that we can compare your competitors with. And if you won't give them the model, we can't really just count on your use of it. So it took a while, but the people that wanted to keep it proprietary basically slowly said, yeah, it's better if we make a public version of it. And what I found was that we still had a few more TRW projects we could add to it, but I was teaching these software economics and courses at UCLA, and the students were from companies, and I would say, one of your assignments is to provide me with at least one project that uses this model and calibrate it to the data that you have on how much effort it took. And what came out of that was that the business data processing people had really different. The cost drivers were very similar, but the exponents were the diseconomies of scale were much higher for the high-tech government kind of things than they were the business data processing things. So we had to generalize the model in some ways so to cover these other kind of approaches. And then TRW said, we will let you publish this in a, another thing that happened was that around the mid-70s, people were starting to write software engineering textbooks. And I said, I want to write a software engineering textbook. And I got TRW to say I could take a semester's leave of absence and in this case, I went to USC rather than UCLA because Alice Horowitz, who was there, said, "Yeah, we need something like this for our program." So basically, I taught a course using the kind of things that I was going to be putting in the textbook, and busily sat there in my office trying to write the pages in the textbook. The first 6 weeks were the most productive in my life because it took them 6 weeks to put a telephone in my office. And so at the end of the semester, I had about 300 pages of stuff. And I had covered maybe 10% of what a textbook needed. And I was in this Donald Knuth conundrum that basically said, yeah, do I want to spend the next 15 years writing 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 of these things? And the biggest piece of it that I had was basically the Costa model part.
Yeah.
So I said, yeah, why don't I just reduce the ambitious level and do a software economics book. And so basically it introduced the COCOMO model, and since I was also teaching them things like what should you be doing about calculating return on investments and doing business cases and things like that, those kind of things went into the model as well. So again, that was an outgrowth of what happened at TRW, but it was became a more general kind of thing once it collided with the rest of the world.
And how would you characterize the type of projects that the TRW software efforts, of which they were a part? Was it, I know there was a big satellite activity, there's a continuing missile activity, but there are other broadenings of TRW's activity. Could you kind of paint a picture of that?
Sure, yeah. The defense and space part of TRW does have a San Bernardino office that covers what the missile people do. The Redondo Beach thing is right next to Aerospace Corporation and the Space and Missile Systems Center. San Diego does aircraft avionics. Huntsville did ballistic missile defense, and Sunnyvale did satellite control kind of things and the like. So and there's a big office in Denver that does similar kind of space kind of things.
Mm-hmm.
And so again, some of these were really opportunities to test whether the things that we were doing in Redondo Beach were really working as well elsewhere. One other interesting example, when we first calibrated COCOMO to the 20 projects, one project was an anomaly in that it was twice as productive as COCOMO said it was supposed to be. And it turned out to be an off-site office in Dayton, Ohio, and our best conclusion was that if you live in Dayton, Ohio, the best thing you can do on the weekend is program. And it wasn't really that way. It was they hired a whole bunch of really smart Purdue people. And it was true that on the weekend they would get together for barbecues and talk shop. And so again, there were different situations in the different parts of TRW that you found. And another big win was that the ballistic missile defense people had some interest in getting better software tools, and so they gave TRW a whole bunch of money to build a software requirements analyzer and a design that mated with the requirements analyzer, and that became RDD 100 and the Vitech company that does those kind of tools. Again, it was fascinating seeing those different parts of TRW defense and space. But the other thing was that as the director of software research and technology, TRW was also a conglomerate that did TRW credit data, and so if credit data had problems, they would say, can you send us somebody over who can tell us something about configuration management? And so basically I would be able to go and understand what was going on in more commercial kind of things. They had a similar group that was doing communications processing, local area network kind of things, and basically they had gotten themselves into a problem in that they built a system that worked very well for one client, and then another client wanted something that was somewhat different, and they would try to warp the original software into something that satisfied the next client, and found that it was easy to be optimistic about how much effort it would take, and then they would end up doing, they had a cowboy mentality. They had about 4 people who could pull 4 consecutive all-nighters and deliver the next version for the next, but it was an untenable kind of situation. And they had other people that were doing point-of-sale systems, and they were really good at system engineering the points-of-sale systems, and very good at marketing them, but they weren't really very good at manufacturing them and integrating them and the like. And eventually we ended up partnering with Fujitsu, who basically built the hardware for point-of-sale systems much more reliably than TRW was doing it, and so again, this got me involved in a bunch of projects that TRW was collaborating with Fujitsu on, and the like. One project that I hadn't mentioned was that because of the Japanese rise in auto manufacturing, the other big part of TRW is the auto parts company in Cleveland, and so the T stands for Thompson Products, right. and basically he bankrolled Raymond Wooldridge to become TRW, and we would occasionally do things for them. That, for example, they started putting software into their carburetors and said, we don't want any $5 million or 5 million car recalls because we got the carburetor wrong. Could you send us some of your formal methods people who can mathematically prove that the carburetor software has no defects in it? And another thing that we ended up doing was building because of this yellow peril that the company said we've got to get better at productivity, and something came down from Cleveland that said every division has got to come up with something that will improve their productivity. And so my general manager basically said, yeah, what can we do? And so we did a study of what were people doing to improve productivity, and what kind of strategies could we do, and so we found that you really needed a mixed strategy. That there were a bunch of things that were really more personnel oriented. If you could give everybody who stayed on the project for the whole project a bonus if it's successfully completed, then we had less turnover on those projects than we had anywhere else. We visited IBM and found that, yeah, they were investing in single-person offices and saying that if you keep your people in bullpens with the phone ringing all the time, they're losing flow, and you should give them an opportunity to think and be more productive. And so we came up with a proposed software support environment for at least the Missile and Space Division that I was in at the time, and did a COCOMO analysis that said, yeah, if we can get our tools up from an average of nominal to an average of between high and very high, if we can get the personnel turnover to decrease and things like that, we should be able to double productivity. And
Double.
And so we said, yeah, if we believe the COCOMO model, let's give it a try. And so the division general manager did get some extra funds to get the thing started, and said, well, yeah, you can pay for the rest of it with your productivity increase. So again, we did another round of exploring different support environments and workstations and the like, and so yeah, we came up to Xerox PARC and took a look at that and said, "Woo, that's wonderful." But basically, they wanted $50,000 a seat, and the company said we can do $10,000 a seat, but that's there were a bunch of adequate Unix-based kind of workstations that we could put the rest of our software on top of, and so basically this the other thing that our division general manager said we needed to do was to get him to identify a pilot project. And so it turned out that we had a 50-person pilot project that was just coming on board, and So basically what we needed to do was to make sure that everything that we were doing was going to satisfy, help them improve their productivity. And so this was a really good thing, because I had hired a couple of people from UCLA and UC Santa Barbara that were very good at Unix, which was what we were going to use for the system, and they turned out to be really good, but let's see, where was I going on this? Well, yeah, they had things that they thought were really good computer science, but may not have been the things that were directly related to productivity. And so they would come up with automated test generation capabilities or things like that, and we would have periodic meetings with the pilot project, and they said, what we really need is something that when we change a document, puts a marker in the margin that says, here's where the change is. And this sort of deflated the scholars some, but basically it did improve productivity and things like that. So it was good to have that project there to sort of keep us going. So we built it, and it did double productivity for them.
It did double?
Yeah, right.
Wow.
And subsequent quad projects did as well. So in our division, it turned out that unfortunately there were other divisions that were not as software intensive, but said, yeah, we want to do fancy graphics, and we're going to have a fancy graphic interface for our support environment. And so after about 5 years, the super boss said, yeah, we've got to merge these. And so again, it turned out to be a really complex but satisfying thing, and the private offices worked fine. A good example was, one of the programmers came out of his private office and said, anyone for lunch? And the neighbor said, it's 4 p.m. You've been out there programming all day.
Well, it sounds like that wide-ranging across TRW, while it rendered itself into a conglomerate, was also a wealth of experiences for when you went to USC to teach. Such a wide exposure to all the different kind of problems people could face. But I did want to, literally before you got to USC, you had your time at DARPA, and I'd be interested to hear just how that invitation happened.
Okay, let me just finish the USC thing. That another thing I was fortunate to be a part of was Simon Ramo's Electronic Technology Advisory Committee.
Oh, wow.
And he basically included software as part of the electronics. And so we would have monthly meetings that said, what are we doing well, what do we need to do better, and what technologies have you been hearing about that the rest of us ought to know about. So at this one meeting, basically several people said, we can't get enough software people. And it's the end of the 70s and into the 80s, and real estate prices are going sky high, and the people in Iowa and Wisconsin don't want to come out to California and pay those prices. And so what can we do to entice more people to come? And one thing that Cy Ramo was envious of, he had come from Hughes, and Hughes was owned by a foundation which had a lot of resources, and they used some of those resources to come up with a Hughes Master's Fellowship program where people could get a master's degree at UCLA or USC, and in the kind of things that Hughes did, which were avionics and space and the like still. And that TRW didn't have one of those, and so Simon Ramo asked me, can you go and work with USC and UCLA and see if they would like to have a special master's program in software and computing technology. And so I wasn't sure whether the universities would really be interested in yet another special program that might want courses that they didn't teach and the like. But in both cases, they succeeded. I think for two main reasons. One is that all the students would be U.S. citizens, and even then, we were getting more people from India and the like, and so again, the other thing was that Simon Ramo agreed to give each computer science department chair an annual donation if they would sponsor this program. So we did it, and it was successful. One of the things, though, that Simon Ramo said to me is that, we don't want the people that come out of this to be just plain super programmers. What I've found at TRW is that our best engineers are T-shaped people. They're deep in one discipline, but they also understand a lot of stuff about other disciplines. And the people that we would hire from bachelors in computer science were very I-shaped. And so when I was reaching early retirement, I said, what do I really want to do? Do I want to be here for another 10 years and retire at 65, or do I want to try to do something else? And what I decided I really wanted to do was to try to make I-shaped bachelors in computer science people into T-shaped software engineers and more system engineers. And that's what we've been doing with, we broadened the curriculum and put in human factors and user interfaces and management and economics and hardware engineering and the like. And then had this project course where everybody had to not just code something up that somebody gave them the requirement, but they had to interact with the clients and find out what are your needs and opportunities and what can we do in 2 semesters to build something useful for you. And so that was about what I thought I was going to be doing in 1989, is early retiring from TRW and going to either UCLA or USC, and at that time there was a DARPA program on advanced environments, and since we had built this productivity system, we were able to collaborate with actually Lee Osterweil and Laurie Clark at UMass, and Dick Taylor and Deborah Richardson and the people at Irvine on what is the next generation advanced software environment going to look like, and what does its architecture look like? What kind of architecture validation tools does it need, and what kind of user interface should it have? What kind of ways does it? How is it going to address things like the internet and RESTful services and all sorts of exotic things that were coming along, and so basically I became part of this program for DARPA called Arcadia that Dick and Taylor and Lee Osterweil were basically the two leaders of it, but DRW was bringing its piece of things to the party. And so this got me involved with DARPA a lot more than I had before. That we had done some things like we wanted to be one of the first nodes on the internet, and so we got TRW to put up the money to be a node on the internet and the ARPANET. So the sponsors of these this Arcadia project were two DARPA programmers, Steve Squires, who eventually became the chief engineer at Hewlett-Packard, and Bill Shirless, who went back to Carnegie Mellon, is now running their software engineering department. They were trying to find somebody to, the old director, Jacob Schwartz, was phasing out by the end of the summer, and then they were looking for somebody, and said, "Hey, would you be interested in doing this?" And I said, I don't have any grad students, I don't have any TRW projects. If I ever wanted to do something like this would be an opportunity, and it's got such tremendous leverage, and not just ARPANETs and software, but it had supercomputing, it had the world's most impressive network-based training facility for tank drivers that the world has ever seen, called SimNet, and a big budget. Basically, I spent $1 billion of the government's money in the 3 years that I was there, and spent the time basically being briefed by people who were the smartest people in AI or the smartest people in robotics or whatever, and my brain was fried by noon. I was just, but somehow or other, I learned a lot from all of these people, and we were able to do some fairly significant things in the software environments area with building on Arcadia and the like, and the other thing that Steve Squires and Bill Shirless had done the year before was to get DARPA to give money to the Software Engineering Institute to set up a computer emergency response team,